Welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. And now, here's Chris McCann.
Good evening and welcome to E-Bible Fellowship's Bible study in the book of Genesis. Tonight is study number 30 in Genesis chapter 35, and we'll begin reading in verse 23. The sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, and Levi, and Judah, and Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, and the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's handmaid, Dan and Naphtali, and the sons of Zilpah, Leah's handmaid, Gad and Asher. These are the sons of Jacob, which were born to him in Padan Aram. And I'll stop reading there. Okay, I've mentioned this a couple of times to give everyone a chance to look into it and to pray for wisdom, and also to give me the same chance to consider more what could be the answer. Now, if you're wondering what's the question or what's the problem is that we read of the 12 sons of Jacob born to various mothers, and then the concluding statement, the end of verse 26, these are the sons of Jacob which were born to him in Padan Aram. Padan Aram is Syria, and all the sons were born in Syria except Benjamin. Benjamin, we just went through this chapter, and we saw he was not born in Padan Aram. Actually, in Genesis 35, verse 9, and God appeared unto Jacob again when he came out of Padan Aram and blessed him. And then a little further down, in verse 16, and they journeyed from Bethel, and there was but a little way to come to Ephrath, and Rachel travailed, and she had hard labor. And it came to pass, when she was in hard labor, that the midwife said unto her, Fear not, thou shalt have this son also. And it came to pass, as her soul was in departing, for she died, that she called his name Benoni, but his father called him Benjamin. And Rachel died and was buried in the way to Ephrath, which is Bethlehem. We can see very clearly that Jacob had left Padan Aram, and according to the account, Benjamin was born en route to Bethlehem, with a little way to come to Ephrath or Bethlehem. And so the statement, again in verse 26, these are the sons of Jacob, including Benjamin, which were born to him in Padan Aram. Now, the most obvious conclusion or the most obvious solution to the problem is that Benjamin was conceived in Padan Aram, and having been conceived, and at the time they came out, must have been just prior to their leaving Syria, and at the time that he fled from Laban. The Lord must have blessed Jacob and Rachel with a child in conception at that point, and then he fled. And all the information we read concerning Shechem and the troubling experience with the people, the men of that city, occurred, and so the account of the gathering of the earrings and the idols and burying them, and what we read about Deborah's nurse dying, all must have happened really very closely in time. That is, within a 9-month period of leaving Padan Aram to the point of Benjamin's birth. And actually that helps us, if it's correct. It helps us in the dating, because we know they came out when Jacob was 100, after he had spent 40 years there. and it was the year 1907 BC. And if Benjamin is conceived in the year 1907, it's likely he's born in 1906. In 1906, it counts downward on the Old Testament side of the cross the next year or within the next year. And so we're right within that time frame, and Jacob is likely 101 when Benjamin is born. And that seems to solve the problem, and it has to be considered. Well, that is, again, the most likely and obvious solution. But the word born, where we read, which were born to him in Padan Aram, is not a word that is used in regards to conception. I haven't been able to find that. It's the same word that we found that was used as travailed. Remember that word? Travailed, and the word midwife, and the word delivered. It's the word that identifies with birth, with giving birth, being born. And so that's a problem. However, when we look further into the word, we find that this same word is also translated as beget or begot. Let's go back to Genesis 5. In Genesis 5, and I'll start reading. We could really read this whole section, but we'll just start in verse 9. And Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan. And the word begat is this same Hebrew word translated as born and delivered and so forth. So Enos lived 90 years and begat Canaan, and Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years and begat sons and daughters. And the word begat is the same word in all, I think it's found 3 times. Now, we have learned that when we read that Enos lived 90 years old and begat Canaan, that this is not as it appears to be. This is the secret, this is the mystery in which God hid the biblical calendar of history. It appears that when Enos was 90 years old, he had a son named Canaan. He begat Canaan, or being born Canaan. But the actual explanation is that when Enos was 90 years old, he begat a son who would later be the progenitor of Canaan, or the line from which Canaan would eventually come from was started when Enos was 90 years old. Now we read that he had sons and daughters. So, just think of it. Here's Enos, and let's say he has 5 sons. And of one of those sons, of the descendants of one of those sons, will eventually come forth Canaan. So when Enos is 90, that particular son is born, and then he will have sons, and maybe another generation after that, until finally Canaan comes forth. Now, of Enos's other sons, they're not the line. They did not produce Canaan. So that's really what's in view. When Enos is 90, he had a son, or maybe even a daughter, but he had an offspring from which Canaan would be born. And the way the Lord laid out the biblical calendar is the next statement in verse 10 of Genesis 5. And Enos lived after he begat Canaan 815 years and begat sons and daughters, and all the days of Enos were 905 years, and he died. And you see, Enos is the biblical calendar reference patriarch for the duration of his life, from the time of his birth until he dies. For 905 years, in other words, God would reckon the calendar of history, or the dating of time for that period was according to the lifespan of Enos. Just as later we'll read of Noah, and God will record events based on the life of Noah. In the 600th year, in the second month, 17th day of the month, the flood began. The 600th year of Noah. That's how time was reckoned, how it was kept track of, that the flood occurred in that 600th year. But when Enos was around, he was the calendar reference patriarch. It would have been the 700th year of Enos, 800th year, 905th year, he died. And at that time, you need a new calendar reference patriarch, because you can't continue to keep track. According to the life of Enos, he's now dead. And that is where Canaan comes in, because in Enos's 905th year, Canaan would have been born. The earlier reference when Enos was 90 and begat Canaan, again, was designed by God to throw people off track, to hide the truth of the calendar so they would not be able to find it until the proper time when we were reaching the time of the end. It would be necessary to have understanding of the calendar, or else the people of God would not be able to properly discern time and judgment. They would not know when various very important things concerning the flood, concerning the creation date, and many dates in the Old Testament that were necessary for the Lord's people at the end of Earth's history to know and understand. How could we know, for example, what God said, "Beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing." And if you're not ignorant, to be ignorant is to lack knowledge and understanding. To be not ignorant is to possess knowledge and understanding. A wise man's heart discerneth time and judgment. The wise will understand, but none of the wicked. And therefore, to know what God said, "Be not ignorant of this one thing. One day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day." In the context of the flood in the end of the world, you'd have to know when the flood occurred. And so God revealed the flood date, 4990 BC. 4990, and one day is 1,000 years. The statement to Noah, "Yet 7 days, and I'll bring the flood." 7,000 years from 4990 brings us to the year 2011 AD. And so that's what God did. But getting back to our search for understanding concerning how Benjamin can be said to have been born in Padan Aram, well, now we have to consider he was begotten. And although this is a different matter, isn't it? For one, it's speaking of men, and, well, yeah, Jacob, to him was born Benjamin, so that would still be in view. But of course, he was born to Rachel, and we'll look at another statement having to do with a woman in a little bit. But it is a different matter that this word begat or born to Enos when no one was actually born at that, or when the individual said to be born, Canaan, was not present in the world and would not be born for many hundreds of years later. But it goes beyond conception, doesn't it? Canaan would not even be conceived again for 800 plus years from the time that Enos was 90. And so that does seem to allow for the definite possibility that Benjamin was conceived. He was begat, and in actuality, he existed in Padan Aram, but would come forth in the trip on the way to Ephrath or Bethlehem. That does seem to solve the problem. If we go to Exodus 6, we read in verse 20, and Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. Now this is telling us of Amram and Jochebed, and many theologians think, because of the language, the way it's worded, that they are the parents of Aaron, Moses, and Miriam. And, we can see why. But we also know that God is verily a God that hides himself, and he is truth, so he hides truth. And just as he hid the truth in Genesis 5 concerning Enos and Canaan's actual relationship, not immediate father-son, but it certainly appeared to be immediate father-son, so too is he hiding information here. If we go to Numbers 26, we find this statement in verse 59, and the name of Amram's wife was Jochebed, the daughter of Levi, whom her mother bare to Levi in Egypt, and she bare unto Amram Aaron and Moses and Miriam, their sister. And again, the word bear, it's the same word that's translated beget. And though it's very specific, these three, keep in mind, we found biblical evidence of a biblical calendar being kept in the same manner as we read in Genesis 5. That is, end to end. When the life of one individual would come to an end, the life of another individual that God would assign the biblical calendar patriarch, he would be the reference patriarch, began. For example, when Levi entered Egypt, it can be deduced he was 60 years old, and therefore spent 77 years in Egypt, because the Bible tells us in Genesis 6:16 that Levi died at 137. And then let's go there. Genesis chapter 6, verse 18. We read, and the sons of Kohath, Amram, and Izhar, and Hebron, and Uzziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133 years. And verse 20, and Amram took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137 years. When we put Levi's 77 years spent in Egypt together with Kohath lifespan of 133, Amram's lifespan of 137, and Aaron's age at the time of the Exodus of 83, we come to 430 years, and the Bible tells us that was the exact duration of Israel's stay in Egypt. 430 years to the self-same day. And so that would mean upon Levi's death, Kohath was born, and then Kohath lived 133 years, and the year Kohath died, Amram was born, and then concerning Amram, we're told that he took him Jochebed, his father's sister, to wife, and she bare him Aaron, because Aaron's the oldest, and God tied together the timeline to Aaron, not Moses. Now, we would probably expect Moses to be named first because he's the greater of these children, but it's Aaron based on his age. She bare him, or begat to him, Aaron, Moses, And over in Numbers, it tells us Miriam as well. And Miriam certainly was the older sister of Moses because she followed the ark when the mother cast Moses into the river and was able to go up to the princess of Egypt and say, should I find a woman to nurse the child for you? But you see, it's basically telling us that when Amram married Jochebed, she begat Aaron, but not at the time that Amram and Jochebed got married, and not, they didn't have Aaron as a son because that would overlap the calendar. No, it wasn't the case. It was similar to Enos begetting a man, a son, who would later get, down that line, later would come Canaan. And the same here, Amram and Jochebed had a son he would marry, and he would have Aaron as a son and Moses and Miriam as children. And they are the unnamed couple that are mentioned, I think, back in Exodus chapter 2, when Moses' life is in danger due to Pharaoh's edict that all the male children are to be slain. Well, that again gives us the basis, the justification for understanding, because we had to find biblical justification. We can't just make an assumption that it means conception. But this word translated as born definitely has the idea of begatting, and as we look closely into the Bible's understanding of that word, it can mean someone in the line of, and it might even be hundreds of years before the person is actually conceived and then born. So certainly this word can also identify with conception in the land of Padan Aram, and then the birth of Benjamin en route to Bethlehem. Okay, going back to Genesis 35, we read in verse 27, and Jacob came unto Isaac his father unto Mamre, unto the city of Arba, which is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned, and the days of Isaac were 180 years. And Isaac gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people, being old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Now, the way this is worded, it appears it happened right away. Jacob traveled to see his father, and then his father died at the age of 180, and then the twin sons, Esau and Jacob, buried their father Isaac. However, no, not so fast. We know Isaac's birth year, 2067 BC, and so we know that he would be 180 in the year 1887 BC. But remember, we were just talking about how Benjamin was conceived in Padan Aram, which was the year when Jacob was 100, the year 1907 BC, and more than likely born the next year, 1906 BC. Well, how do you go from 1906 BC in verse 26 and 27, and then in verses 28 and 29, it's 1887 BC. That's a period of 19 years. 19 years. And now keep in mind that God is, for his own purposes, telling us Isaac died at that age in that year, and he did. And then he was gathered unto his people. But there's certainly events that take place from the time that Jacob journeyed to Isaac his father after Benjamin's birth and Rachel's death until Isaac died. And we can know there is, without any question. Just turn over to Genesis chapter 37. In Genesis 37, starting in verse 1, And Jacob dwelt in a land wherein his father was a stranger, in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was feeding the flock with his brethren. Okay, so Joseph is 17, and we know Joseph was born when Jacob was 91, and that was in the year 1916 BC. But again, Isaac would not die until 1887 BC. That Joseph is born in 1916, he would be 17 in the year 1899 BC, which is 12 years still to go until Isaac dies. Isaac will not die for another 12 years, 13 years inclusive. It is interesting, from this point when Joseph is 17 until 1877, that's the midst of that famine when Jacob comes before Pharaoh at the age of 130, and then all Israel enters into Egypt under the care and protection of Joseph. Well, from this point when Joseph is 17 until that year 1877 is 23 years inclusive. And I thought that was interesting. It'll be 23 years inclusive, and Joseph will be 39 then. And so we see both these numbers that appear often in the Bible. 13 inclusive years from the time Joseph is 17 until Isaac will die. 23 inclusive years until that dividing point that we can spiritually relate to the time of the Great Tribulation. Okay, well, just wanted to point out there is a gap of time of 19 years, it appears, between verse 27 and 28 and 29 when Isaac dies. Lord willing, we'll pick up our study in the book of Genesis when we get together in our next Bible study.
Thank you for joining us for E-Bible Fellowship's Evening Bible Studies with your host and Bible teacher, Chris McCann. For more studies and information, visit our website at www.ebiblefellowship.org. Until our next Bible study, may the Lord's perfect will be done.